My name is Alex Matthew. Global Hi, thanks so much for tuning in. You're watching BQ Prime. My name is Alex Matthew. Global warming and climate change are issues that the world is dealing with. And the regulatory framework in several countries is changing in order to face this new threat. Now, the regulatory framework that we're speaking about today is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It has been framed by the European Union, and today we're going to talk about the implications for Indian exporters to Europe. Joining me to talk about this very important subject are Ajay Shah, the co-founder of XKDR Forum, and Akshay Jaitly, who is a co-founder of Trilegal as well as Trustbridge. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time. Pleasure speaking with you. To lay the foundation of this conversation, for those that are unfamiliar with the CBAM, as it is abbreviated as, Ajay, could you take us through the key features and what the genesis of this was?
The way we should think about this is that when there is taxation of pollution in one country, then there is always an incentive to move production to another country. So, for example, mercury emission in Europe is taxed, but it is not taxed in India. So naturally, the Indian company that is emitting mercury poisoning into the ground will gain market share because it seems that they have no difficulty in producing mercury. Now let's apply this to the problem of carbon. The Europeans are taxing carbon in the hope of reducing global carbon dioxide emissions. But if they stop at that, then potentially it works out badly because production will merely move out of Europe to a location like, say, India. So the same carbon will get emitted and European companies will lose market share. So in order to solve that, what the Europeans have done is that alongside their internal taxation of carbon, they have introduced this border tax that when goods come into the country, they suffer the identical amount of carbon taxation. And this is the recipe given by economists universally, that wherever you have a carbon tax, you also need this carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM.
I believe that there have been conversations by policymakers about this, and there has been an ongoing debate on this. It is viewed by people in India as protectionist in nature. Is there a possibility that this gets challenged and challenged successfully in, say, the World Trade Organization?
Well, at the moment, the European Union seems quite confident that this whole scheme is WTO compliant. There is no doubt in my mind that whether it's India or another country, some people will try and test this at WTO. But remember, as Ajay was saying, that what this is doing is actually equalizing the situation between European producers and importers. So the European producers are already subject to a carbon tax as part of the European emissions trading scheme. And what this is arguably doing is just leveling the playing field for those European companies that are subject to that regime by making importers or rather people who are exporting into the European Union pay the same price.
Okay, fair enough. The next question, of course, and it's coming to you on this one, Akshay, is what are the implications? Ajay spoke about the timelines, so we're still a while away from the implementation of this, but I'm guessing that the companies that are going to be most impacted at the start will already have started working towards it. What are the implications?
Well, the first implication, as Ajay was suggesting, is for Indian exporters, especially steel and aluminium, to start calculating the amount of carbon that is contained within their production process. What this means is that in order to fulfill the reporting requirements that kick in later this year. So we know that there are some companies, and we know this partly because there is a scheme of voluntary reporting that a lot of Indian companies have submitted themselves to, where they are reporting the amount of emissions that are contained in their manufacturing process, and are even placing what is called an internal carbon price on their production process. So these are companies that are probably doing this or probably started doing this to be good corporate citizens and to fulfill the requirements of the growing number of ESG investors that exist that want to understand how clean or dirty the production process of their investee companies are. But this is also obviously going to be very useful to fulfill the requirements that Europe puts into place. I think that some of the details of what the reporting requirements are going to be are still being worked out, but that's the first step. The second step, and which is also something that a number of Indian companies, including companies in the aluminum and steel space, are doing, is starting to source renewable energy for their production processes. Now, this is being made easier by a number of policies, both at the central and state government levels. We are all quite familiar with the rapid explosion of India's renewable energy space. But the ability to source clean fuel for production processes is something that is another step that companies are already taking and will have to ramp up on. These are two of the major things that immediately come to mind.
Okay. In terms of the expansion of the scope of this, Ajay, you already spoke about the potential for more sectors to be added. But something like an IT, which is India's largest export, is that something that also could come into the purview of this? And what is the potential of that?
Computer servers are now a significant user of electricity all over the world. So I have no doubt that IT operations will come under the purview of carbon taxation, not just in the European Union, but all over the world. Now, it is also the case that it's not efficient to place computer server systems in India because of the combination of the cost of renewable energy and the high temperature, so that the cooling cost goes up. So generally, an Indian service provider will place their facilities in Greenland or Iceland or Oregon, places where the temperature is low, so the cooling cost comes down, and places where renewable energy is plentiful and cheap. But I have no doubt that carbon taxation will come for IT services and operations export activities.
Now, Akshay, in terms of the response, and you've talked about the implications, and Ajay has just spoken about the potential for the expansion of this all the way to the IT sector. In terms of the response for these companies, I'm sure quite a few of them have already started working on them. You mentioned renewable energy being thrust, but this has implications for the cost structures, for the investments that they will have to make. Beyond the first few measures that they will have to take in order to comply with these regulations, what more should these companies be doing?
I think as Ajay was saying, the location of industries within India is going to become a factor that companies will start looking at. So there are certain states that are easier to set up renewable energy facilities in than others. There are other states which also allow more freely the import and export, so to speak, of renewable energy from outside the state borders to within the state borders. So I potentially see an arbitrage for states in this space to be able to offer opportunities where people can green their supply chain and therefore relocate or set up new facilities in that particular state. So I think there is going to be some amount of competitive federalism opportunities in this area as well.
That's interesting. So I would think, again, for the policy response of states in India to facilitate the setting up of a value chain that will lead to this, right? So that leads me to the next question, Ajay, which is, what is the policy response from the center, if at all, in the face of changing regulations related to climate change, not just in Europe, but the world over?
So Akshay and I have been thinking and writing extensively on this subject. The first part of the response is that the Indian electricity system needs significant reforms in favor of making market forces work, so that there is a private sector domination on the decision making about how to generate, where to generate, what technology to use, establishing transmission capacity, building distribution. The whole thing needs to become a private dominated environment where private people make decisions and the sector is not centrally planned under the guidance of government officials. And the second part of that is that we need a carbon tax in India also. For India to decarbonize, the lowest cost to society will be obtained through a carbon tax rather than a government official determining the required fuel efficiency of a car and the required energy efficiency of steel production, which is all a central planning approach where government officials control the nature of production of the economy. It's far better to just establish a graded system of taxation, which will keep going up every 5 years, so that by a certain date, the net carbon use of India basically goes to zero.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's assume that India does introduce such a tax. Akshay, how does this change the competitive landscape for an Indian exporter, say to the European Union, assuming that they have also set this tax in motion?
Alex, this could be really significant. And the reason for that is that the amount of duty that you pay at the European border in terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is dependent on whether or not you have already paid for that carbon in the country from which you are exporting. So if India had a carbon tax of 10, and if Europe has a carbon tax of 15, then you would only pay 5 at the border. So there isn't one single rate at the European border. The amount that you pay depends almost entirely on to the extent to which the exporting country has already charged for the carbon embedded in that production process.
Okay, so that's definitely something to think about on the policy front here in India, and a great reason to consider the introduction of such a tax when a lot of geographies, manufacturing countries specifically, are moving towards it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time. Always a pleasure speaking with you.